Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Especially then. I think I'd like to offer a bit more of a formal introduction for you today. Principally being a founder of life itself and a pioneer at the edge of research and communities of intention and practice, and recently the author of Collective Wisdom in the West, Beyond the Shadows of Enlightenment with Perspectiva. So, yeah, I haven't mentioned your cognitive science PhD or any of the other things that you've done, but I think there's probably far too many interesting connections between both of our interests for us to possibly comprehensively explore today.
Yeah, exactly. I think the other thing might be that I do run a kind of neuroscience and contemplative dialogues with the monks at Plum Village to help to organize those, sort of build a conversation around that with some of the Dharma teachers at Plum Village. Brothers Faklin and Fapalu, and in particular, are very active in that. But yeah, those are, I guess, some of the major connections. We just finished a neuroscience retreat, so I have to mention that. People can go and look at the videos from pretty soon of some interviews with David Sloan Wilson and some of the monks, and Ruth Lanius, who's a expert in trauma, sort of the neuroscience of trauma. We interviewed her, and so there's a bunch of different really good interviews with monastics and scientists that just got put up as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm interested. I mean, maybe this is we can sort of set off from here, and somehow it will lead us into the themes that you've been exploring in your book and elsewhere. But I wonder what it is about being at the intersection of neuroscience and, the effects and the palpable shifts that are possible with spiritual practice, with meditative practice in particular. Like, what is it for you that you feel has sort of drawn you to be so close to that? What's the sort of aliveness of it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of by nature inquisitive and have a kind of just intellectual bent. My background really is I kind of sometime as a teenager, I decided I wanted to understand social reality. I was going to do whatever I needed to do to understand that. I always loved history and economics. I wanted to understand society and really help to make a better one. And so I was very into Jiddu Krishnamurti and also social science, and I kind of wanted to bring those together, and I also wanted to understand economics. So, my whole life has been kind of like trying to figure out social science, but also having this really deep intuition that when I listen to Buddhists and mystics from India, and the Asian traditions, we can say, like Krishnamurti, it's like, yeah, there's just something about that. When I listen to Foucault or something like that, well, it's interesting, but I could kind of easily understand it quickly. But when I first heard Krishnamurti, I was just like, he's really right about something, but it's profound. Like, I don't really understand it. I kind of just know that he's right, and I never would have thought of that. Some of the things that he said, and so I always felt that we needed to break there's a kind of wall in our intellectual traditions that doesn't allow in the the ultimate dimension, as we'd say in Buddhism, or actuality was Krishnamurti's term. There's various, but I consider myself as essentially like I sort of was a scientist. I'm maybe more identified with contemplative practice now, or at least as much. But within the contemplative community, I'm kind of a specialist in ideas, right? Like the real measure of realization is kind of, is your total centeredness. And there's people who are better meditation teachers than I am. But my specialization is like, one of the thinking guys in the contemplative community who can kind of communicate and interact with the world of ideas, and kind of help to direct people towards the people who are better teachers than I am, at this stage anyways of my practice. And I think that's really, it's just a continuation of what I'm interested in. I think science, how can you say, there's certain relative dimension truths, like life has a lot of suffering, like the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, and that a lot of our suffering tends to come from psychological, we call attachments, or heavily held expectations might be a better word for some people, because that we can get free of those, and that there's kind of a path, right? Those are intellectual statements that people can kind of grasp. So we always say that those types of things are rafts to cross the other shore. I think science can help people grasp some of those rafts better, or we can make modern rafts. We can make, it's almost like high-tech rafts with, contemporary technology, though you won't get more than a raft, right? We can't ever pretend that we're going to get people to the other shore with science. We can help that people, especially in this culture, understand the rafts that the ancient ancestors have already provided better. And so, I think that's kind of an ambition, and also how those rafts might relate to some of the things that we're experiencing now as far as our overall, dumpster fire of a political and environmental situation. So that's kind of, what I try to spend my time doing as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that dumpster fire, the last few days for me has sort of been a feeling of that fire is heating up somehow. And of course, we've been in perennial states of crises in many different ways for years now, but beginning to recognize that there is patterns and trends and some of the possible futures of those patterns and trends really don't look good for the sustainability of our civilization. And by that, I mean both global human civilization in relationship to the biosphere and the plants and the air, and all of that stuff. But I also mean Western civilization as well. Freedom to, this ephemeral thing that we have that we don't quite see, but we only see it in comparison to when it's been taken away. And so, yeah, both of those things have been very alive for me. And I think we talked about this once before, but sort of very early on in that, for me, I saw Sam Harris as kind of somebody who was doing a kind of bridging that was very radical at that time. And, without connecting his work with your work too much. I see you as also doing a kind of bridging that's very necessary for this moment in time, because we're in a scientific paradigm. We're in a scientist kind of paradigm. Or really to just recognize that we're in perhaps a paradigm is too limited, but we are in a matrix of thought and institutions and technologies. And I think the first thing to do is realize that. And to realize that, we have to, of course, slow down.
Yeah.
Been right at the heart of what I've been exploring with SenseSpace, but I also feel it's, somehow the simple core of some of the Buddhist practice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts, in Buddhism, that's kind of my background. My emphasis is Zen, which is a form of Mahayana Buddhism. And as we all know, Buddhism has reinvented itself a number of times. Western Buddhism is pretty young, so it's still like the Dhamma is not. There's kind of, how do you say? There's a sort of the Mahayana and Theravada schools, right? And just quickly, it's like you could look at the Buddha taught a certain way, or he had a certain Dhamma, and you could see that as kind of the way to teach, or you could see it as the way that he happened to teach or find skillful to teach ancient Indians. And Zen comes from a tradition of, okay, there's another way of teaching, and particularly it was actually after Buddhism had become quite scholastic. And so these kind of riddles and puzzles and koans of Zen were actually to get around scholasticism that had accumulated around Buddhist practice, right? This kind of reification of the metaphor of the path into this kind of idea, that people were engaging with, rather than the direct reality that you would do when you would engage with during following the breath, right? As soon as you get away from practice, you kind of start losing that connection, and the more you get attached to the ideas, the more you feel those are your vehicle by which you can understand reality and attain insight. Then you start losing it, right? And I think Zen was a response to scholasticism, and now in this Western culture, we need another response. And so that's kind of, I would say, like, it's almost like science is like the reincarnation of the modern times. Like the Buddha had to speak in terms of reincarnation because Indians understood reincarnation, and today's Dhamma for this culture should speak in science because it's speaking to people who understand science. And it's actually not it's quite a good language to teach to get things across as far as they can be gotten across. It's just at the same time you have to undermine scientism, right? That this idea that science can give us all the answers, right? That's the hard bit. But I think that can be done. And so that's kind of part of the challenge, is realizing that the intellect can only do so much, and all that science will ever be able to do is take us towards the edge of what the intellect can do. And then there's practice and, direct realization, which is beyond that. And that's, that will never be taken over by science. It just simply can't.
No, I don't think it can. Yeah. That's really interesting. Just feeling like you're kind of, yeah, I'm learning some very useful sort of connectors in my map between those different Buddhist traditions, and recognizing in the process that I'm very much a student of, that Western first generation, I guess, of like a lot of guys in the 50s and 60s who did or didn't do acid and then went to India and Asia. Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfeld and Alan Watts, and Sam Harris being sort of a further generation after that. But those are the people that I have learned from. I haven't spent any time in Tibet or India or with many people in robes, and I did briefly spend some time with the London Buddhist Center and dabbled in community there, but find myself charting my own path that sort of dips in and out of different things. And I find myself losing my train of thought. It's such an esoteric journey to go on.
Yeah, well, it's just practice. That's always, I think it's always like, if one starts to find abstraction, that things feel abstract, and it's just good to get back to following your breath as well, because abstraction is kind of like the sensation of an ungrounded thought, to use some cognitive science, right? That are ideas, what we talk about as just ideas, are the ideas that we're conscious of as ideas because they feel abstract. The computer is an idea, to some degree. I have a Jacob concept, and it feels really grounded to me. So, it's an embodied concept. And our most useful ones are the ones that work with our perceptual system, that we're creating a perceptual spatial reality with, and those are very potent. And when you get the feeling of abstraction, what it means is your concept isn't grounded. Your mind isn't managing to find a direct experience. For example, attachment, for a lot of people, it's a bit like, maybe don't, if you don't meditate, don't spend a lot of time thinking about attachment as the end of suffering, because you can hold attachment kind of the wrong way, and that's a good route to alienation, because people might think, if you don't kind of practice letting go and have a way of grounding that, then you can end up using, well, I have an attachment as the source of suffering. It's a way of kind of like, okay, I want to get away from attachment. Right. And so if it feels abstract, then just let it go, just don't worry about it, and get back to practice. And maybe, the first noble truth that suffering is part of life. If you kind of just watch your suffering, then the teachings start to have a way of becoming less esoteric feeling. I think that's always my approach, to stay away from being esoteric. It's just watch what gives me grief and pain in life.
Yeah, I very much resonate with that, and returning to the immanent, without getting too scientific about what that immanent reality is. That's sort of the place I'm looking to hang out. So however much I, go very deeply in or out, depending on what way you want to look at it. And with that, there's necessarily a letting go of this experience of reality in order to sort of get into a more heart expanded non-self reality. I think that surrender or that letting go is ultimately a letting go into the immanent reality as such. So you end up loving people more.
Yeah.
Rather than cutting off from emotions or using meditation as a trauma coping tool, which I certainly recognize myself as having done in the past. So,
well, that's all right. You know, I mean, it's they always say take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, which is just like your spiritual ancestors, the teachings they left, and your spiritual friends, and kind of like it's sort of natural to just cope a little bit. It's just like you know, we don't want to hang out there forever, right? I think that's kind of the thing, is that it's fine to take refuge or in some ways get away from things in meditation, but then also to be with it. You know, when you bring your meditative energy to, you know, regular life and start watching yourself, then, you know, I mean, that's kind of like the book that you mentioned, the intro. You know, I feel like drawn to talk about attachment a little bit beforehand, because I noticed when we start talking about attachment that a lot of people do kind of end up holding it the wrong way. And so it's a bit like, how do we say, so it's like living in opposition, that if you know, so the environmental movement, okay, we don't like, we decide, well, growth is a bit of an issue, so anti-growth. You know, we or technology or progress is an issue, so you know, the myth of progress has kind of seduced us, so we want no technology, right? And so you're not free from the thing. It's not freedom, it's opposition. And there's a way of holding the idea of attachment that, okay, well, I notice that attachment is a source of suffering, and I notice that I have attachment, so what I want to do is kind of get out of the way. That's just more imprisonment from attachments, right? It's more, or imprisonment by, rather, attachments. It's like teenage rebellion or anything else. It's kind of the natural movement of the mind, and then letting go and finding distance from the attachment, or being, you know, not making what you want really separate from the rest of life, to just hold it. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm holding on to that, notice it, and see what happens when you really notice that you're holding on to something, maybe that's precarious, maybe that doesn't have a certain integrity, and just see what happens, you know. And I think that's what I like to do with my work, is kind of, especially that book, is it's a bit like, well, let's just become a little bit more aware of what our cultural suffering is. So, you know, what the Dhamma of the West right now would be a bit like, well, you know, there seems to be a lot of suffering around here, as you say, precarious future. Where did that come from? And kind of the point of the book is like, the Enlightenment is a pretty grandiose term for point in history, right? And so that might be a place to look for why we're in a, you know, what some people call meta crisis. It's that there was a period of our history where we decided that we were enlightened, and that sounds like an idea that we're attached to. And the book isn't let's not be enlightened. Let's get in touch with those attachments, that we've acquired, and see what happens. Basically.
Yeah, this is a really interesting terrain, I feel. There's almost two elements that I'm holding here is like attachment in relationship to pain or to trauma, to disconnection from life, which obviously can be personalized and localized to the individual self and childhood, but it is also rooted within the ancestors and the ancestral soil. So what happened in the West during the 20th century was a profound explosion of psychic shadow, trauma, violence, shock, and the context in which that occurred was not one with a really richly developed understanding of integrating all of this stuff. So that stuff's gone into the soil, and how far down we want to look in the soil is perhaps one of the questions around the meaning crisis. Is like, well, do we look at the horror of the 20th century, or is it really further down to the Enlightenment, perhaps? Or, some people want to go back to the origin of written language. And I think all of these are true in a meaningful sense. So that was the pain part. And then we have like the ideas, the attachment to ideas. I think part of the attachment is that we almost think that there is just ideas, and we don't account for ways of knowing or sort of epistemic categorical assumptions about the way things are that we're also attached to. So the idea of the mind as the brain in the head, as the captain of the body. This
Right.
One of those assumptions that we've just been living out of, and now is very gradually starting to be peeled away. And we're realizing, I'm not just up here, I'm centered here, I'm centered down here, there's a brain in the gut, there's the whole integrated being. So maybe we can hone in a little bit on some of these blind spots of the West. And I'm very interested in the role that you place of like rebalancing rationality with not knowing and mystery. And yeah, I know you're into the left brain, right brain, and the neuroscience of this. So please fire away.
Yeah, I mean, I go with what we've been kind of discussing before, dialoguing about before. It's just that, okay, a lot of what we're going through right now and what we went through in the 20th century was a lot having to do with the myth of progress, which was kind of that there's a rational way of understanding things. Science can give us the answers. In particular, the West was perfecting science and was this kind of more advanced society. It's almost entitled to rule the rest of the world. Dawn of the 20th century, Western countries essentially collectively had this empire that, in one way or another, controlled most of the world. and and that is kind of, well, it's the way it should be, because we have a rational system, right? That was the idea. That's obviously, hubristic, and people have noticed that, and we've spent a lot of time talking about, say, deconstruction, right? So that there's the mirror, there's the things that we talk about as ideas, as we discussed, kind of, which are the ungrounded concepts, and then there's the created reality, which we call, maybe constructions, to use a term that goes even, back to Piaget. We talk about deconstruction, Derrida, but there's a whole school of psychology that are constructivists that would say that, like, look, you're actually, these ideas are literally creating your embodied experience of reality. You've woven them into your waking reality. And those, so the things that you think are just concrete things are also ideas, or they're these kind of hybrid, weaving of sensory experience shaped, morphed into a particular form by your ideas, right? And so, because we identify with the brain, your head probably is over present in your personal construction of yourself. Like, if your actual embodied experience of yourself has maybe a lot of head in it. And many Westerners report this, right? That as opposed to people who thought the center of the self was in the heart, in ancient cultures like Egypt, would experience a lot more torsos. They're actually kind of their moment-to-moment experience of themselves had a different construction. There's nerves that are, and sensory input that are underlying that, but they created a different sort of percept out of it with their ideas, right? And so that's just one example. But I think it's this idea of, okay, some of the ways that we're constructing things might be really problematic, right? And I think my strategy with the book and just what I'm working on now is like, well, because we're not very good at that, because the idea is a bit like you have to go into your sense reality, sense your attachments, right? That's a grasping that's always involved. There's always a grasping involved with kind of seeing the world a certain way. The kind of sense of self that you have as a construction, which is a making of a thing out of perception, and that is kind of what we're referring to with grasping, and letting go is of that is a sense that you have when you step back. Sometimes, if people meditate, they will kind of spontaneously notice sometimes they have suddenly a very different experience of their body that has more space in it for more of their body, right? Suddenly your shoulders are there, suddenly, your legs are there, suddenly, when you're following your breath and you're feeling it go throughout the body, and that there's this kind of ripple, and then suddenly there's a different sense of self that kind of spontaneously emerges, right? And so that's a kind of displacement, or a way of seeing the body in a way that's different from the way we usually construct it, right? And the idea of kind of, say, deconstruction was a bit like, well, we need to get under our ideas. My feeling is that it's a bit of a skill, like embodied. It ends up, when you talk to most people who do kind of deconstruction, it feels very still like intellectual, like quite like one doesn't get the impression that really we're getting past our ideas. It's a bit like psychoanalysis, right? Where many people who go into some forms of psychoanalysis or therapy end up having a lot of statements about themselves, and kind of can tell you all about their issues, but they don't change the way that they are very much. They don't manage to let go of their fear, their particular ego, need to be important, inflated sense of importance, right? You have to actually go into your inflated sense of importance and see, I'm going to really feel how, overly important I am, explore, my kind of thoughts I'm ashamed of, see, that those are a bit ridiculous, about how important my personal work is. And then when you do that, like really do it and see how kind of it conflicts with things, and your self-importance tends to get spontaneously less less grandiose, less inflated, and so it's a bit of like, that's the kind of work that we need to do with some of our big ideas from the past. And so I've focused on rationality, individuality, secularity, and then equality, controversially at the end. But I think that's going back to rationality. The reason why we're so bad at that is because we're stuck in rationality. The way to get out of bad behaviors is to have rational arguments that those don't work. So because reason is all important, and what you need is rational arguments, that then you can't get out of that, right? If you take that first leap, you're stuck, right? So that's the first one that you have to get a hold of, is delusions about rationality and how much it's worth to have a good idea or know something.
Yeah, I'm feeling like what we're doing right now, there's an interesting like weaving up and down going on between the importance of somatic experience and breath. And as you're talking about breath, I'm becoming more aware of breath. And then that's actually kind of shifting the tenor of my listening or the conversation. And then up to the philosophical and idea, and these key ideas that are from the Enlightenment that are somehow becoming the animating forces of today, but also realizing that those, whenever you have a slogan or a very simple meme that is not connected with lived experience, then really it's not going to be an effective judge of character. If my identifying as an anti-fascist does not tell you a great deal about what I am for. It merely tells you that I am strongly against something. And of course, every authoritarian movement in the history of the world has been strongly against something. So, there's a whole element of behavior in the noosphere, in the conversation, in the mimetic landscape that feels like an adolescent process. And somehow like coming back to the development of self is a good way of understanding what's going on. And I know because I went from being Christian to agnostic to pretty strongly atheist. And the thing that convinced me of it was rational argument. And the thing that shifted me out of it was not really rational argument. It was more like psychedelic experience. Something that is not accounted for in that whole understanding. And further to that, having had an experience that opens up possibility, then beginning to get some of these practices going, get some movement practice, get some breath and meditation, begin to listen for something that's uniquely calling to you. An inquiry of some kind, a curiosity, and to follow that. And whenever you do follow that, it will take you beyond yourself and probably beyond this mimetic tribe, this, in-group speak. And you might find, I'm connected with people who actually are going to reject me if I stop speaking the same linguistic thing. We're all in agreement. We all agree.
Right.
Right. But there's so much unresolved psychic material, I think, somehow there. And yeah, I mean, as I said before, I've been getting very into existential risk and various geopolitical things for the last week with my girlfriend. So this question of, the destabilization of the West has been feeling very palpably alive. The rise of China combined with this sort of very inward-looking civil unrest. So there's some real shit going on. There's some real consequences to the ideas, whether you're looking at Evergreen State College and how that maps onto universities, or you're looking at the city of Portland having riots for 120 days. What are the kind of spaces that are created when the flag of being against the state or against capitalism or against racism, what comes in the wake of that, we don't know, but we have good indications that it very quickly turns into a playing out of all that material and a power struggle, and not a very free kind of place at all.
Right. It's there's a lot of psychological violence that comes with rationality. I think it's, what we get, because there's a right way, right? As soon as you get into rationality as the guide to everything, then there's a path. That's what's so seductive about it. Well, there's kind of a path to, even you can say, salvation or a just society. And and so equal individuals is kind of the moral, framework, the moral infrastructure, and sort of ideological infrastructure through which we've tried, sort of almost tried to solve the problem of justice, right? And when you solve a problem with, humans, we decide to have the solution. Psychological violence is inevitable, right? And that's, more or less what, I spend a large part of the book arguing, is that, it's just, we've been trying to turn the world into, a problem with a solution, or life into a problem with a solution. That's what happens with problematizing. That's a movement that you can get in touch with again. That we can kind of just feel that there is something that it feels like to be certain and in control. And does it feel good? It feels great to be certain and in control, it feels, people, that's why they loved computers at the beginning, why sort of applications are addictive. You just kind of, type the keys, and things happen. And then you get used to that, right? The types of pleasure that comes from control tends to go away when we get used to it. This is kind of like the hamster wheel, right? That we always talk the hedonistic hamster wheel, right? That because once you've started getting used to a certain pleasure, then it starts to go away, right? But then when your computer doesn't work, you know how you're attached you are to it because you freak out because you have such heavy expectations it's supposed to work exactly some way. When it starts doing anything a little bit wrong, immediately the impulse to kind of bang on the keys or something like that, right? And it's a bit like society as a whole has gotten to be a bit more like that, kind of that type of feel that we kind of expect things to just work. And we've been constructing these, systems to make things work like they're supposed to. And essentially, it's very, of course, there's a deep morality behind everything that goes on, under the name of wokeism or whatever. I don't want to kind of delve into that term or whatever, but people kind of know what I'm talking about. Like, there's obviously like our fundamentally pro-social ability for love is also part of that, but right alongside that, there's kind of ego, right? In the mind, the intellectual mind, the ego is a kind of a construction of the self, right? It's an attachment. It's the kind of construction of yourself that you are attached to, and being right morally is a big part of that, of what egos do. They're correct. People like to be right. Our egos like to be right. Being you and I, that we experience, that mystics experience, right? That there is a non-separation, right? Not only are we kind of equal, but we're the same, right? This is like equal in the eyes of God, right? Is that really, this is like a metaphor that we're all children of God. None of us is better or worse in God's eyes, but rather we're equally sacred, right? Our consciousness, our experiences are equally sacred. We're equally human. And then there's kind of surface equalities, which are, well, what does it look like if you have that kind of saintly perspective? There's some equalities in the way that we could be treated that are sort of metrics, right? So like equal rights. It's true, that, if you equally care about everybody, then you should have equal rights. And then, equal outcomes, perhaps equal opportunities, under which I'd kind of talk about a lot of the stuff that like equity, or the conversation about equity is really like deep equality of opportunities. That, equality of opportunity is not handing somebody the same book. That's obviously kind of ridiculous. Like, oh, everybody gets the same book, so they had an equal opportunity to learn. Like, well, no, it's like making up for inequalities in the family life, in the environment that people grew up in, etc., and bringing it so that there's kind of a flat playing field, is kind of the fundamentals there. And again, it's to get back to that idea. It's not be in opposition of that, like, oh, that's so stupid, throw it away. It's just, well, those are some really potent ideas for public policy that we should be in touch with, but we should also be in touch with how we're using them. Like, what does it feel like to believe that? And what does it feel like to be, and what is it like to be really attached to those ideas delivering social justice? and what actually happens when we are in that state, right? And all of those ideas start to sound like a route to the promised land, but are they? That's the question. And if they were a route to the promised land, maybe they would be justified. But there's a contradiction there, because the promised land is, the route of a promised land, the route to which is cruel, is just no longer a promised land, right? So there's just this fundamental contradiction that we're not quite clocking, mainly because we're so identified with the route, and I think at some level know that it's not working, so that the more identified you are with the path or pursuit, the more you kind of resist evidence that what you're doing isn't really working, right? Or that it might not work. And I think that's that's kind of the dynamics of it. And it's the same, it's a practice thing, really, to just get in touch with the way things are. It's very understandable that people would get attached to that. It doesn't make them stupid. It doesn't make them, lesser human beings. It's just, that's the way we are with everything. And we're all quite infected with grasping. I would call it the grasping disease. That's like whiteness. What the Europeans have brought to the world is this grasping disease, and the kind of everything we've been talking about is a bit of the grasping disease, and that is kind of the essence of what we really are, I think, gesturing towards when we talk about whiteness as a problem in the world or anything like that.
Something tells me that particular label is not going to age very well. In a few decades or a century looking back, it's going to be it's going to feel quite rudimentary.
Oh, which one? Whiteness?
Whiteness, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's not very good. I mean, because it's alienating to a lot of people, because basically equating whiteness with privilege in the way that's done. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are voting for Trump because they feel, which is true. It's just, American society intentionally just decided it didn't matter. Kind of people who don't have more than a high school education, who have blue collar jobs. They've just been ditched by the government of the United States, right? And so language that makes it sound like to them that they have these enormous privileges is very alienating, and they are now essentially Donald Trump campaigned against when he said, we love to argue with them, don't we? Well, he's talking about people who uncritically equate I'd say being a white male with something great, and being white with something that's really sort of wonderful, and you have an easy life. And that's to say, I say that as somebody like totally fits me. I got a good university education. I don't find it problematic. People tell me I'm privileged. Yeah, I am. Absolutely, I've been privileged. I've been very lucky, but at the same time, I don't think that language is the most skillful language as far as building a better politics. Because it doesn't fit a lot of other people as well as it fits me.
Yeah, I think these words, they all connect with reality in some way. There's some truth to those maps. And there's, something legitimately to be concerned about that all of them somehow point towards. That the problem becomes almost the univocality of maps. Just learning that one map and being like, I've got it. And that attachment to knowing that you described. And if you just bring it back to relationship, anybody who's had a parent or someone they're in a relationship with that always knew, that person's a really difficult person to be in relationship with, because the thing that blocks them from entering into not knowing is something in here, something that's, some trauma, it's almost a paradox of disconnection tends to create more attachment to a certain view of the way things are. And I welcome that map, but I also welcome a multiplicity of other maps. What do these things mean? What does privilege mean? We were talking before about how I've been really realizing how much working class attitudes around possibility and opportunity and money was so quietly entrenched in the background for me. And just recognizing how disempowered my ancestors have been. The people who were for king and country and probably pro-empire and all of that stuff were living in a system of control. Working class identity is a system of control, and attitudes around gender and class and all of these things. So, and in equal time, a lot of people really spouting off about their own privilege or other people's privilege, suffering greatly in their mental health and anxiety. And finding that their solution doesn't get down to the depth that actually brings resolution for themselves. So that's really, really important.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's really important to say in that because particularly in the shift that we need to make culturally, the equation of most of those conversations really risk reifying the connection between money and basically goodness of life, right? And that's something that's really, problematic. It's not that we want to totally get rid of that, right? Because obviously money does matter, and obviously some people have more access to more of it. But at the same time, the conversation tends to be not totally, but quite a lot about status and economics. And to the point where it really seems to embrace completely the value system that's creating all this injustice sometimes. And I don't know always quite how to get out of that. And these are always the really difficult knots, because you don't want to just reject the idea that inequalities and opportunities to make money matter. It matters hugely. It's just kind of not the only thing. And then there isn't really a solution. It's just sensing into the heaviness of the language and, kind of suggesting to a person that maybe their perspective comes from privilege, rather than telling them, affirmatively that it does, or suggesting to a person that their life might be easier, instead of telling them affirmatively that it is, would make, in many cases, just all the difference, right? It's really about tone. Like relationship, coaches and psychologists worldwide will tell you that, like your chances of success are basically, it's about tone of voice. That's the biggest indicator. And yeah, I mean, if you look at our society, and you look at the tone of voice, then in the political discourse, then you kind of can get a sense of where the issues are coming from. It's just, it's the tones of voice are not the tones of voice that you approach a problem that you really want to solve with. Really, if you've really deeply connected and it needs to work, then there's another kind of tone of voice which is a lot more measured.
Yeah, I feel that somehow bringing it very much back to yourself and the approach that you've been taking with this is somehow beyond all of the content and the critique, is the embodiment of the approach to it, which seems conciliatory. And yeah, so very much touching on what this whole podcast has been about for me, and just discovering the potential of conversation. Since these disembodied idea wars are occurring on disembodied mediums of communication, something quite important about getting back to this, because this is where not knowing and nuance and multidimensionality can come back in, because that's how we experience our bodies.
Yeah.
This, to be in touch with intuition and the feminine, I think it's more of a sensing into and around, rather than a sort of firmly supposed form or idea or any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it. I mean, I think really the main point of that book is that, of course it sounds a bit hypocritical, but that the main thing we need is not more books, but just like more practice, but practice that focuses on these actual real issues, like all the stuff that people have been writing, Zizek and Derrida, and about ideology, that we're drowning in it. I mean, I loved it. It's true. Like Zizek's the most ideological statement that you can make is that we have no ideology, right? But the way to do something about that is, on every level, sort of cultivating just a sense of what it's like to be determined by ideology. And I think this is my real hope with this kind of, all of the arguments around social justice and wokeness, or whatever you like to call it, that at the end of the day, you know, people are going to realize that those ideas are really valuable. At the same time, it's the practice of holding them in a way that's just useful for everybody. That's just a practice, right? It's like how you hold these kinds of ideas, you know, not getting rid of them, but just holding them in a way that really is impactful in a good way for everybody. And more so than they're wrong, they're right. It's just, yeah, no, equalities, you know, these surface qualities are great, you know, there's nothing wrong with these metrics that I, you know, was talking, nothing, they're really useful. It's just how do you engage in lots of psychological violence while trying to use them to move us towards a different society, or are they a way of challenging people's awareness? You know, if you think about it, would this world look like that if you really saw everybody's equal value? And not really, you know, that's like, and you don't have to back down if they say, oh yeah, no, it would. Really? You know, I mean, there's ways of saying like, look, I don't believe that. I don't believe you that, you know, that I don't believe that, you know, you don't have a single, you know, non-white employee in your entire company yet, you know, just by accident. Or, you know, because, and that you really are valuing everybody's chances equally. You know, I mean, it's always just, to me, it's like finding a way to look, be in touch with those ideas, but also the equal humanity of the person that you're criticizing, right? Like Django Unchained is some, you know, something that I talk about in the book, right? Like that's precisely like, you know, there's this contradiction. We all want to be equals, but nobody wants to be average. We all want to stand out in every way possible, including morally, which means standing for equality more than the next person does, right? And then you get this heavy measurement. This, oh, we just have to hate the racists, to the point where then you make kind of movies about killing racists, right? You know, like Django Unchained, and kind of have like the audience getting up and whooping, and it's this cheapest kind of moral thrill to kind of, you know, hate dead people and get on the side of Django, you know. You know, it's like, it's not that, of course those practices were awful and totally inhuman, but kindness cheering for the death of a slave master isn't really like putting you in touch with the kind of morality that, or me in touch with the kind of morality that I personally need to stand for a better world, right? And though that kind of movement of the dehumanizing the dehumanizer, I mean, no wisdom tradition in the world has ever advocated that. None of the major ones, really. You know, okay, maybe one or two, but certainly not Christianity, certainly not Buddhism, certainly not what most of us, you know, believe in, certainly not our own moral codes. You know, we can argue about, you know, some, you know, some sub, you know, sub traditions, but most of the world's wisdom traditions, it's not, you know, it's not advised, you know, and for good reason. I think, you know, we're really, it's not really asking ourselves the right questions there.
I feel like we could just continue tunneling down this and it would take us back out and back in and back out. Endless traverse of the current moment. But I feel like, you know, sometimes that it's rather than radicalism being changing somebody else's thought, rather to change their experience. and to be able to sit across someone and just, be in silence together and be in not knowing together and realize how uncomfortable that is when you're starting out. That's a relationship that's neglected. And yeah, I'm really thankful for this conversation, and I'm interested to see where you're going forward at this interesting in these many intersections, and hope that the Dharma sword can be brought to bear on cultural illusion even more forthrightly. And yeah, being very compassionate seems to be a helpful orientation towards all the blind spots, both personally and collectively. So
it's the only one place to start, right? I mean, if you can't be compassionate towards yourself, first of all, you can't be compassionate really towards other people. So I mean, it's sort of, yeah, that's the first challenge, really, I think, is compassion. Or at least in this, with regard to what we've been speaking about.
That's a great place to end. Thank you.
Thanks.